On January 25, 1957, Gainova, Quindio, Colombia, in a small rural home of crooked boards and tin roofing, Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos drew his first cough. The cradle that held him shook not with familial warmth but with echoes of fear. His father, Anibal Garavito, was a man ruled by cruelty and alcohol, and his mother, Protrudis Cubillos, by neglect. Born into those fractured walls, young Luis's fate was irreversibly marked. As the firstborn 6 sisters and 2 brothers followed, Luis grew in a breach of love and order. The house teemed with noise, not laughter, violence, not tenderness. Stories collected later paint scenes of childhood under siege, beatings from Anibal, moments of desperation from Gertrudis, who often looked away. The children learned early to disappear, to become invisible. For Luis, that invisibility stung. He was punished often and without cause. He was scolded for minor missteps, speaking out of turn, trailing behind in chores. The threads that bind bonds between parent and child frayed long before he understood. When he began primary school, Garavito was 9 years older than most classmates. He wore thick glasses, and his wardrobe was ragged. His classmates called him Garabato, meaning scribble, a cruel slur mocking both his appearance and his odd behavior. Teasing turned to isolation. Teachers would mark him tardy, homework incomplete. He sat alone at lunch, eating shadows while others laughed. As years wore on, he rarely smiled. Reports later describe him as quiet and withdrawn. One teacher recalled, "He spoke little, carried no friends, drifted along like a leaf in a stream." Learning syntax did not reach his core. He struggled to read, to write, but pictures he sketched practicing shapes and numbers clawed had emotions he couldn't name. By 5th grade, his formal education was extinguished. At roughly age 10 or 11, he was pulled from school to help support the family in the fields, tending cattle, planting coffee, making ends meet. Books became distant ghosts. Into adolescence, he carried a hollow ballast of shame, fear, and hunger. In 1974, at age 17, he endured the first of several psychiatric breakdowns. His condition ebbed and flowed. By 1980, he was admitted to San Juan de Dios Hospital in Armenia, after cutting his own arms with nails. The event was reported as a psychotic episode. He raved of voices tormenting him, commanding action he could not name. A psychologist's official note carries the chilling quote, "I wanted children." No further explanation. The staff transferred him to the psychiatric ward for a brief period, returning him soon after to the streets, releasing him to treat with the factory of oblivion rather than healing. After hospitalization, Garavito drifted through towns, Quito, Tunya, Pereira, his body a road of detachments. He arrived in Armenia, Quindio, in the early 1980s, and took up work as a laborer for small construction crews. He lived in a ramshackle boarding house alongside other vagabonds, men without name, men as if auctioned off and lost. He carried a small bundle of clothing and a few silver-threaded needles, which neighbors later recalled were hidden in his shoes, and inside seems to keep them safe, hiding the very tools of his shame. At night he would dream of children. At lunch breaks, he would linger on street corners, in front of schools, under fruit-laden street vendors. He wore a smile too polished, pale, hesitant. He carried lollipops and candy, occasionally slipping them into a child's hand with a murmured excuse. He studied children's faces, how they registered kindness, how they recoiled. He watched shy ones, outgoing ones, even those giddy with innocence. To remember. Then came the earliest known offenses victims still living. At least 2 boys, aged 8 and 10, reported assaults in 1981 near gas stations and markets in Armenia. The cases went unsolved: minors who muttered incoherently, families who did not trust the authorities. Garavito slipped back into the murk. Surveillance was sparse. Colombia in the early 1980s had porous police membranes, especially around marginalized boys. Even within that darkness, something about him shifted. He began mimicking the worst pages of humanity he'd encountered. He kept a copy of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, a callous artifact for a loner, but one he clutched for reasons he'd later refused to elaborate. He spoke occasionally to himself of mass graves, of anonymity and violence. These thoughts remained private, fossilized fragments of his psyche until they were not. In the late 1980s, because medical care was sparse, Garavito acquired a stash of implements. Threads, wires, pieces of cloth. He hid them with his sister under her bed, a shameful secret. He began to walk more frequently near boys on their way home from school, capturing their faces, memorizing gait, estimating flexibility, width of neck. He did not touch them yet, not visibly. But he watched. And when the school children returned home, afternoon rays spreading into lines, he followed. The pattern escalated. By 1990, local communities whispered of an unseen presence. Boys at the edge of town began to disappear one by one. First, the neighborhood suspect was dismissed. Runaways, said the authorities. But the disappearances intensified. 20, then 30, then more, vanish into thin air. Families could not find them. Most lived in impoverished villages, no camera to trace them, no highway to link cases. Only silence, and the terrible knowledge that someone was taking children. Garavito, still a nobody in a battered coat, was tracking them from across that silence, while police remained static, chasing ghosts. In October 1992, a break. A 9-year-old named William Trujillo Mora was lured by Garavito near Pereira, forced into a wooded area, tortured and assaulted, but William escaped after 12 hours. Town elders said, "He looks like a beggar in rags, but he was strong. He spoke calmly, not like a monster." William's mother's tears stained the village square as she recounted the story. One moment her boy had slipped from school, the next he stumbled his way home, eyes wide, bleeding, telling of horrors that could not be spoken. That survivor's testimony began to thread notes across geographical and chronological distances. Police began to correlate missing to survived ratios. Something monstrous was awakening, with ritual and method. Garavito had crossed the boundary that separated abuse from homicide. By 1993, communities circulated warnings. Beware the beggar with the white scarf. He visits near riversides in the afternoon. But such warnings faltered. Villages where remote radios crackled static, police did not mobilize. Garavito moved between Bogotá, Ibagué, to Itama, pretending to beg, to mend shoes, to be the fragile, sympathetic man who could not harm. His features were unremarkable. Gaunt, hollow, sunken brown eyes, the kind people glance past, but some noticed that he did not belong, and remembered. In the solitude of abandoned buildings, remote hillsides, he began to escalate. Children from indigenous and poor campesino communities became targets. They did not speak Spanish well, did not register as missing quickly, did not attract press. Garavito started burying bodies in shallow graves, marking them as memorials of forgotten children. Over hours, he sketched maps in his head using rivers, hills, and fences as coordinates. Police files later captured dozens of such coordinates, drawn from interviews and confessions, where boys lay hidden, unidentified, uncelebrated, until he named them. Survivors became fewer. Bodies surfaced in clusters around Armenia and Pereira. A mother in one town wept, hands shaking. "We thought he was God sent or a devil." They saw no pattern yet, but they saw fear. By the end of 1993, at least 28 children were dead across Quindio, Risaralda, and Boyaca. Yet, For Garavito, this was just the opening act. The shape of his violence was becoming defined. Colombia in the early 1990s was a land of sharp contrasts. In the mountains, the mornings smelled of wet earth and ripe coffee, while the cities swelled with buses, vendors, and the rhythm of daily life. In these same streets, a man moved quietly, blending into the background. Sometimes he walked with a limp. Sometimes he hunched over as if burdened by years of hard work. He carried a bag, a bottle of cheap liquor tucked inside, scraps of rope hidden away. His name was Luis Alfredo Garavito, though in most of the places he passed through, no one knew it, and even fewer could have imagined the horror he was leaving in his wake. By this time, Garavito's crimes had taken on a deliberate, almost methodical shape. The disappearances were no longer confined to one region. He traveled through Quindio, Risaralda, Val del Cauca, Boyaca, Meta, Huila, Antioquia, and beyond, moving between small towns and cities, striking once, then vanishing before suspicion could take root. Colombia's police network was fragmented. Missing child reports were often handled at the local level and rarely shared in real time between departments. A boy could vanish in one town, and a week later another in a neighboring province, and there would be no immediate connection drawn. In these years, Garavito was targeting boys between 6 and 16, most often between 8 and 13. Many were street vendors, shoe shiners, or schoolboys walking alone. Some came from displaced families fleeing the violence of Colombia's armed conflict. They were children on the edges of society, easy to overlook, and Garavito knew it. He looked for signs of vulnerability: a child standing alone, lagging behind friends, one who seemed polite and unlikely to resist an adult's request. Witness accounts collected years later described how he could take on many roles. In some towns, he appeared as a street vendor selling sweets or trinkets. In others, as a farmer looking for help with livestock, or a charity worker promising food and school supplies. On certain occasions, he dressed as a priest, wearing robes and a cross to inspire trust. His voice was soft, paternal, the kind that could calm a child's nerves. He called boys a mi hijo, my son, in a tone that felt protective. Every disguise was calculated. Every approach was tailored. Garavito moved constantly. He rode buses, caught rides in delivery trucks, and walked the dirt roads connecting small villages. The towns he chose were often near major roads, easy to enter and just as easy to leave. When police later mapped his movements, they found his crimes stretched across at least 59 towns and 11 departments. He rarely took a child far from where he found them. Instead, he would gradually lead them toward the semi-rural edges of town fields, wooded areas, abandoned houses. He chose places where no one would pass by, where noise would not carry. Survivor accounts painted a consistent picture. In 1992, 9-year-old William Trujillo Mora was approached by a man matching Garavito's description near Pereira. William remembered the glasses, the limp, the calm voice that shifted to anger without warning. He was lured away, assaulted, but managed to escape after 12 hours, a rare survivor of what was by then a growing killing spree. Another boy in Bogotá in 1996 described being offered money to help move boxes. He refused, and that refusal may have saved his life. His description of the man would later match composite sketches of Garavito almost perfectly. While Garavito claimed later that he was driven by uncontrollable urges, investigators saw something else: planning. He often carried a backpack with rope or cord, a change of clothes, small amounts of money to make his offers believable, and alcohol that he admitted drinking to steady himself. He chose his locations carefully, always giving himself an escape route. This was not random. This was a system. In the mid-1990s, bodies began to surface in clusters. 3 boys in Herrera disappeared within 2 weeks, their remains later found on the same hillside. Two brothers in Tanya were discovered less than 200 meters apart. But Colombia's police network was so fractured that these clusters in different regions were not connected until years later. Fear began to spread in towns touched by these disappearances. Parents kept children home from school or walked them in groups. Vendors in marketplaces started passing quiet warnings to each other about strange men seen loitering. Some of these warnings mentioned a bespectacled man with a limp. By 1998, his pattern had become his greatest weakness. The age group, the settings, the disguises, the way he moved from town to town, it all began to form a profile. But the recognition came too late. By the time investigators began to link the disappearances nationwide, Luis Alfredo Garavito had already taken well over 100 young lives, leaving behind a map of grief that stretched across Colombia. The first killings investigators could later tie directly to Luis Alfredo Garavito began in 1992, but the true scale of his spree would not be understood for years. Colombia in the early 90s was already reeling from drug violence, guerrilla warfare, and political instability. In many rural towns, police presence was light, sometimes just one or two officers covering miles of farmland. Against that backdrop, the disappearances of boys seemed like isolated tragedies, each one explained away as a runaway, a victim of the armed conflict, or a casualty of street crime. But they were not random. They were the early beats of a single, long nightmare. Garavito had learned the advantage of movement. He rarely stayed in one place long enough to draw suspicion. After a killing in one department, he would board a bus to another, taking only what he could carry in a backpack. His trail wove through Quindio, Risaralda, Val del Cauca, Huila, Meta, Boyaca, and Antioquia, touching small towns where people knew each other by name. He favored market days, when streets were crowded and a stranger could blend in. He would arrive early, loitering near schools, plazas, and bus stations, watching for a boy alone, a child whose poverty made him both visible and invisible at once. The disappearances began to cluster. In Pereira in 1994, the families of 3 boys filed missing person reports within days of each other. All 3 had last been seen with a thin man in glasses, carrying a bag. 2 years later in Tanya, 2 brothers vanished on their way home from school. Their remains would later be found together in a patch of scrubland just outside town. In rural Huila, 4 boys went missing in the span of a month. Still, no one connected the dots. Local police handled each case separately. There was no national database to link the patterns. Garavito was careful to keep moving, and he was patient. Sometimes weeks would pass before he struck again. Other times, he would take 2 victims within days. He often timed his crimes to coincide with religious or public events, when crowds would allow him to blend in and travel without drawing attention. He drank heavily before and after, a habit that dulled his fear and, in his own words, gave him the courage to do what he did. He carried rope, cord, and sometimes a change of clothes to alter his appearance after leaving the scene. Bodies began to be found in similar conditions, in semi-rural areas on the edges of towns. They were left where discovery was possible but not immediate fields, coffee plantations, thickets near roads. In many cases, multiple victims were found in the same general location, suggesting that Garavito returned to sites he knew. The forensic evidence, what could be gathered in Colombia's underfunded labs, began to hint at a single perpetrator. But the range of towns involved, sometimes hundreds of kilometers apart, made it hard for local investigators to imagine one man could be responsible for them all. The number of disappearances rose sharply between 1995 and 1998. In Val del Cauca, 2 towns reported a total of 10 missing boys in less than 3 months. In Meta, 3 children disappeared from the same neighborhood. Witness descriptions were eerily similar. a middle-aged man with thick glasses, sometimes limping, sometimes wearing a cap, offering candy or small amounts of money. In some areas, communities began to take precautions. Parents escorted children to school, and teachers dismissed students in groups. Street vendors warned each other about strangers. But Colombia, in the 1990, was a place where daily dangers were many, and the threat of one man unknown, unseen, did not always take priority over the grinding reality of survival. The turning point came in late 1998 in the city of Palmira, Val del Cauca. Authorities were called to investigate the remains of two boys found near a sugarcane field. While documenting the scene, police noticed similarities to earlier cases in other departments' findings, clothing fragments, and the positioning of the remains. Word of this reached investigators in other towns who had seen the same thing. Slowly, files from different departments began to be compared. The patterns that emerged were impossible to ignore. The same type of victim, the same method, the same general kind of location. In early 1999, Colombian authorities, working with child welfare agencies and the national police, began assembling a centralized list of unsolved cases of murdered or missing boys. The numbers stunned them. The list stretched into the hundreds. Many of the deaths were confirmed homicides. Others were disappearances with no body recovered. A disturbing number of them matched the same profile. Garavito's freedom was nearing its end, but he didn't know it. In April 1999, in Villavicencio, Meta, a boy went missing, and the investigation moved faster than usual. Witnesses reported seeing the child in the company of a man in glasses, limping, with a small bag slung over his shoulder. Days later, police arrested a man for attempting to assault a child in a nearby town. His name was Luis Alfredo Garavito. They had caught him not because they had solved the entire puzzle, but because he had finally chosen a victim who fought, who drew attention, and whose disappearance was investigated immediately. It was only after his arrest that the full scope of his crimes began to surface. When investigators laid missing person reports and murder files side by side, the trail of Garavito's years of terror came into view. Colombia had been living with a serial killer moving freely through its towns for nearly a decade. When police brought Luis Alfredo Garavito into custody in April 1999, it was not yet clear to them that they had just ended the most prolific killing spree in Colombian history. The arrest in Villavicencio was the result of a single case, a boy who had gone missing and whose trail led back to a bespectacled man with a limp. At first, Garavito gave them a false name, claiming to be a harmless drifter. His demeanor was calm, even cooperative. But the officers who searched his bag found items that told a darker story: a small length of cord, a few children's trinkets, a dull knife, and an empty bottle that smelled strongly of alcohol. They moved him to an interrogation room, the kind with bare walls and a single metal chair. At the start, he denied everything. He claimed he had been traveling, that he had no fixed address, that he had nothing to do with any missing children. But investigators in Villavicencio had already been in touch with police and other departments. The description of this man matched witnesses from cases hundreds of kilometers away. There was something in the way he tried to explain his movements that raised suspicion. Then came a moment that changed the course of the investigation. One of the detectives placed photographs of two murdered boys in front of him, victims from a town far from Villavicencio. Garavito didn't look away. He stared for a long moment, then asked for a glass of water. After drinking, he set the cup down and said quietly, "Yes, I knew them." The admission opened a door the police hadn't expected to pass through so quickly. In the days that followed, Garavito began to talk. At first, his confessions came haltingly, mixed with attempts to justify himself. He claimed voices had told him to do what he did, that he had been abused as a child, but alcohol made him lose control. But as the sessions went on, the scope of what he revealed stunned even veteran officers. He began naming places, dates, and, most chillingly, the locations where he had left the bodies. Investigators organized teams to follow him across Colombia. In handcuffs and under heavy guard, Garavito was driven from one department to another. At each stop, he would direct police to fields, gullies, and patches of woodland. Time and again, they found human remains where he said they would be. Sometimes there were 2 victims in the same place, sometimes more. In one location outside of Armenia, searchers uncovered the remains of 6 boys within a radius of a few meters. Garavito explained, without emotion, that he had returned to that spot because it was quiet and no one ever went there. Word of these discoveries spread quickly. Families who had been searching for missing sons for years began calling police, asking if Garavito had mentioned their towns. In some cases, investigators could give them an answer-grim confirmation after years of uncertainty. In others, they had to say they didn't know yet, that there were still many sites to search. The scale of the task was overwhelming. The evidence against him grew with each day of fieldwork. His possessions included torn pages from notebooks with handwritten notes about his victims. Some were only first names, others were physical descriptions. There were crude maps sketched with landmarks like River Bend or Old Fence. He carried these with the care someone else might give to treasured photographs. In court later, prosecutors would argue that these were trophies, records kept to relive the crimes in his mind. When the full list of confirmed sites was compiled, the numbers were staggering. Garavito confessed to killing over 170 boys, though investigators suspected the true total was higher, possibly over 200. In many cases, he could describe the clothes the child had been wearing, the conversation they had, and the way he had approached them. The level of detail left little doubt he was telling the truth. Forensic teams confirmed dozens of identities through clothing, dental records, and, in some cases, DNA. The Colombian press began calling him La Bestia, the Beast. His photograph appeared on front pages. A thin man with receding hair, thick glasses, and a blank expression. The public reaction was one of shock and fury. How had one man been able to move so freely for so many years, killing hundreds of children without being stopped? The question haunted police, prosecutors, and government officials alike. Garavito's cooperation in leading investigators to bodies became a point of legal complexity. Under Colombian law at the time, sentences could be reduced for cooperation, even in the most serious cases. This would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the case, as families learned that the man who had taken so many lives might not spend the rest of his own behind bars. But in 1999, the focus was still on the investigation. By the end of that year, prosecutors had compiled an overwhelming case file. It included taped confessions, photographs from crime scenes, physical evidence recovered from his possessions, and forensic reports from across the country. The sheer volume of charges murder, kidnapping, torture meant his eventual sentence, if served consecutively, would stretch into centuries. But in Colombia, sentencing laws capped the actual time a person could spend in prison. Even before the trial began, the legal system was bracing for public outrage over how little time the beast might ultimately serve. Still, for the families who had lived with unanswered questions, the arrest and confessions brought a grim kind of closure. The man who had haunted their towns and taken their children was finally behind bars, and for the first time in years, he would not be able to harm anyone else. The next step was to bring him into a courtroom and lay out the evidence for all to see. When Luis Alfredo Garavito first appeared in a Colombian courtroom, the air was thick with the sound of shuffling feet, low murmurs, and the clicking of press cameras. Families of the victims filled the benches, some clutching photographs of smiling boys whose lives had been cut short. Garavito was led in wearing a plain shirt and trousers flanked by guards. He kept his eyes low, avoiding the gaze of the parents who had come to see him answer for the years of terror he had unleashed. The charges were read in a litany that seemed never to end, count after count of murder, kidnapping, and related crimes. The prosecutors presented the case in carefully assembled order. The confessions, the sites he had led police to, the clothing and belongings of victims recovered in his possession, the matches between his own descriptions and the body. Forensic evidence. They played segments of his taped interviews for the court, his calm voice describing the last moments of boys whose parents were sitting only meters away. Some of those parents wept openly. Others stared in stony silence, their grief too deep for tears. Garavito entered a guilty plea in many of the cases, his admission sparing the court the need to prove every individual charge. In return, he was eligible for reductions in his sentence under Colombian law for cooperation. That fact alone would become a source of national outrage. Under the penal code in place at the time, the maximum prison term a person could serve no matter how many crimes was capped at 40 years. Further reductions for cooperation could lower that maximum to as little as 22 years. The realization that the beast could walk free in a few decades sent shockwaves through the country. Prosecutors pushed for the harshest sentence possible within the legal limits, emphasizing the unprecedented scale of his crimes. The court agreed, imposing a combined sentence that on paper totaled thousands of years, one of the largest aggregate sentences ever handed down in Colombia. But everyone in that courtroom knew those numbers were symbolic. By law, they would collapse into a single term far shorter than the crimes demanded. News of the sentencing sparked fury in the streets. In Bogotá, Medellin, and towns across the country, people gathered to demand changes to the law. Petitions circulated calling for life imprisonment or the death penalty for the worst offenders. Parents of the victims went on television to speak about the unfairness of seeing the man who had destroyed their family's face, the possibility of eventual release. The phrase "no mos bestias" appeared on protest signs and in graffiti, a public cry that this should never be allowed to happen again. Inside prison, Garavito was held in special conditions. His notoriety made him a target, and there were concerns for his safety even among the most hardened inmates. He was housed in isolation for long stretches, guarded closely during transfers. Journalists who sought interviews with him described a man who oscillated between deflection and self-pity, at times expressing a kind of rehearsed remorse, and others speaking in detail about his crimes without apparent emotion. He told one reporter that he wanted to help educate people about child abuse to prevent others from becoming like him, a statement met with disgust from victims' families. Over the years, the legal fight over his imprisonment continued. Each time the possibility of parole or early release was raised, it reignited public anger. Lawmakers proposed reforms to remove sentence reductions for certain crimes, citing Garavito as the prime example of why the law needed to change. Victims' advocates held press conferences, reminding the public of the hundreds of boys whose lives he had taken. In the early 2010s, a report surfaced suggesting that, with good behavior credits, Garavito could be released as soon as 2023. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Politicians vowed to block his release, while legal experts debated whether retroactive changes to sentencing laws could be applied. For the families, the legal arguments felt hollow. They had lived for decades with the loss, and the thought of him walking free reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Through all of it, Garavito remained largely out of sight. He granted occasional interviews, but for the most part, he stayed within the walls of his cell, an aging figure whose crimes had made his name synonymous with evil in Colombia. His health began to decline, and he was transferred at times to prison medical facilities. Still, the fear lingered that the legal limits would one day allow him to leave prison alive. By the time he died in 2023 from natural causes while still incarcerated, many Colombians expressed relief, not at his death itself, but at the certainty that he would never again walk among them. His passing closed the door on a legal saga that had haunted the country for nearly a quarter of a century, but it did not end the grief of the families. For them, the trial and the years of legal wrangling were a reminder not only of what they had lost, but of how a system meant to protect them had failed so completely. Even after the trial ended and the sentence was handed down, the shadow of Luis Alfredo Garavito stretched across Colombia. His name had become a grim shorthand for the nation's deepest fears, and his crimes forced the country to look hard at the systems that had failed to stop him. The scale of what he had done, hundreds of boys taken from towns and cities over nearly a decade, was not only the work of one man's brutality, but also the result of gaps in law enforcement, child protection, and social awareness that had allowed him to move freely for years. In the months after his conviction, there were urgent calls for change. Lawmakers introduced bills to raise the maximum prison sentence and to eliminate reductions for cooperation in cases involving the sexual abuse and murder of minors. The phrase Ley Garavito appeared in political speeches, not as an honor, but as a warning, a symbol of what could happen if the law remained unchanged. Children's advocacy groups pushed for new protocols in investigating disappearances. Under the old system, a child's absence was often treated as a case of running away, unless there was immediate evidence of a crime. Now, there was pressure to treat all disappearances as emergencies from the start. Police agencies began to share information more aggressively between departments. Efforts were made to create centralized databases for missing children and to link them with homicide investigations. Forensic teams received better training in handling evidence from suspected serial crimes. Even so, these changes came too late for the families whose sons had been taken. In towns where Garavito had struck, the memories never faded. Many families had no grave to visit, no remains to bury. For them, closure came only in the form of a confession that their child's name had been on his list. In other cases, remains were returned years later, identified through clothing or DNA, and funerals were held with the weight of decades of grief. Community memorials sprang up, simple plaques, murals, or crosses placed in fields where bodies had been found. In some schools, teachers kept photographs of the victims on classroom walls as a reminder of the children who should have grown up to graduate from those very rooms. Media continued to revisit the case. Documentaries, books, and investigative reports examined every detail, not to sensationalize, but to understand how one man had gone undetected for so long. Each retelling carried the same haunting question: how many more could there have been? Garavito himself had hinted in interviews that the true number of victims was higher than what he confessed to. Some investigators believed him, others saw it as manipulation. But the unanswered question added another layer of unease to an already unbearable history. For the families, the legal debates and media coverage often felt like background noise to the personal reality of loss. Mothers spoke of sons who loved soccer, boys who dreamed of becoming mechanics or teachers, children who had been quick to smile despite growing up in poverty. The weight of their absence was measured not just in years, but in the milestones they never reached. Birthdays came and went. Chairs at dinner tables remained empty. When Garavito's death was announced in 2023, there was a collective exhale. It was not celebration too much had been lost for joy, but it was relief. He had died in custody, and with him went the possibility that he would ever be released. Politicians who had once vowed to keep him behind bars spoke of his passing as the closing of a chapter, but for the families, the book would never be shut. In the years since, Colombia has continued to wrestle with the lessons of the Garavito case. Laws have been strengthened, and awareness of child safety is higher than it was in the 1990s. Yet the story remains a cautionary tale. It is told in classrooms, recounted in police training, and whispered in marketplaces when strangers linger too long near children. The boys whose lives were taken by Luis Alfredo Garavito will never be forgotten by those who love them. Their names may not all be known to the public, but they are remembered in the streets where they once played, in the fields where their laughter once carried, and in the hearts of families who will always see them not as victims, but as sons, brothers, and friends. The beast is gone, but the shadows he cast will remain for generations, a reminder that vigilance and justice must never rest. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more intriguing tales.